What does it do to a person who constantly, repeatedly loses those they love? Who has to watch again and again how those who are dear to them depart from their lives? Sakusa leaned against the wall, his arms crossed and his gaze lowered to the floor. His curls fell into his face, his expression was empty. His thoughts ate him up, he didn't know what to feel anymore. Komori and Aiko sat across from him. Aiko was crying and sobbing, the tears wouldn't stop running down her face. Komori frowned and tried to calm Aiko down by gently stroking her back. What a messed up situation. No one said a word, the silence that surrounded the three of them was horrible. Only the sobbing of Aiko could be heard, nothing else. Sakusa lost himself deeper and deeper in his thoughts, when suddenly the door slammed open and a worried, angry Osamu hurried towards them. "Where the fuck is my brother?" He immediately rushed at Sakusa, grabbed him by the collar and pushed him against the wall. The fact that Sakusa himself was already quite injured didn't seem to bother him at all. Sakusa didn't feel the whole pain anymore either. He didn't feel anything anymore. Sakusa looked into the eyes of Atsumu's brother, who would give anything to kill him right now. Osamu was incredibly enraged, angry and terrified about his brother. Sakusa didn't move a muscle. "What did you do to him?" "Huh?" Sakusa couldn't stop looking into Osamu's eyes, which by now were filled with more tears, and just looked at him furiously. He couldn't take his eyes off him because everything he saw reminded him of Atsumu and it hurt him so damn much. Suna grabbed Osamu's shoulder tightly and pulled him away from Sakusa, trying to calm him down again. "Hey Samu, slow down. Sakusa is badly hurt himself, don't touch him like that." "I don't fucking care. I always had a bad feeling about you, Sakusa. Atsumu should have stayed away from you from the very beginning. He should have never gotten involved with you, this is all your fault." "Hey whoa, Samu. I understand that you're sad and angry, but Kiyo really can't help it. Don't you dare say that. You are all to blame for what happened to Atsumu. Why did you drag him into all your shit in the first place, huh?" Atsumu never got into any serious trouble, he was the happiest person on earth, and since he's been spending his time with you guys, all I see is him getting hurt. His injuries, his sadness, the lies that come along with it. He did all that just for you, and in the end he has to pay with his goddamn life. Atsumu didn't deserve any of this. He should never, ever have gotten involved with all of you. And you Sakusa are really the worst. Never in your life would you have deserved my brother. Did you ever think about how fucked up he was because of you? About how hurt he was because of you? Have you thought about his feelings even once? Samu. Komori took a step towards Osamu and was about to put his hand on his shoulder as Osamu slapped his arm away and scowled at him. Komori raised his hands, signaling that he didn't want to do anything to him. "Don't fucking touch me." "Osamu, Kiyo really tried everything to protect Atsumu, Komori let it be." Sakusa didn't take his eyes off Osamu for a single second. He had already seen how mad Atsumu could get, but Osamu surpassed him by far, and Sakusa couldn't blame him. Osamu clenched his hands into fists and gritted his teeth, single tears streaming down his face. He stared deeply into Sakusa's eyes and gave him a scathing, contemptuous look. Suna clutched his arm, afraid that at any moment he would attack Sakusa again, and this time there really wouldn't be any chance of stopping him. "Maybe it'd be better if you leave for now." Aiko and Komori turned their gazes to Suna. Osamu and Sakusa still stared deeply into each other's eyes, until Sakusa closed his eyes for a brief moment and turned away from Osamu and the others. He didn't make a face and just walked away from the others without a word, the raging gaze of Osamu following his back, literally piercing him. "Keikiyo." Komori looked after Sakusa questioningly, and Aiko also watched Sakusa move towards the exit. Aiko sobbed, her lips trembling, and the tears wouldn't stop falling. "Please let us know if there are any news. Aiko and Suna looked into each other's eyes understandingly, and Suna nodded at her. She grabbed Komura's hand and intertwined her fingers with his, then walked with him towards the exit as well. Komura frowned as he turned to Osamu and Suna one last time just before they left. Osamu was already sitting with his head buried in his palms. He saw Suna crouch down to him and clutch his arm, while he ran his other hand through Osamu's gray hair and spoke something to him. Probably trying to calm him down. Shit. Of all people, why did this happen to Atsumu? Samu, look at me. Osamu slowly raised his gaze to look Suna in the eyes. Suna looked at his boyfriend compassionately, stroked his hair to reassure him, and gave him a weak smile. Hey, Atsumu is strong, okay. Osamu turned his head away from Suna, more tears were about to fall. Suna turned Osamu's chin back towards him, forcing him to look him in the eyes. All Suna saw in Osamu's face was fear and panic. He had never seen his boyfriend like this before. Actually, Suna had only seen his boyfriend cry once in his life. He could only imagine what it was looking like inside Osamu. He's going to make it? He'll make it through the surgery, Samu. Osamu grabbed Suna's arms and pulled him into a hug, burying his head into his shoulder. Suna gently ran his hand over his back. Osamu was shaking all over. I can't lose my brother, Suna. You won't. What if he doesn't make it? Hey. Suna broke away from the hug and embraced Osamu's face, looking deep into his eyes. Atsumu will make it, okay. More tears ran down Osamu's face. Suna leaned forward and placed a soft kiss on Osamu's lips, then pulled him into another hug and whispered. Of course he will make it, Atsumu is stubborn and ambitious. Osamu chuckled a little, which also made Suna relax a bit. Suna broke free of the hug again and sat down next to Osamu, his hands placed over his boyfriend's to squeeze them, just to hold him close and show him that he wasn't alone. Do you want to catch some sleep? It was almost 2 a.m. and both Suna and Osamu were incredibly tired. However, Osamu shook his head. First I need to know how Atsumu is doing. Shall I get us some coffee then? Osamu turned his head and looked sadly into Suna's eyes. He nodded and gave him a very weak smile. Suna smiled back and planted Osamu another kiss on his lips before getting up and looking for the nearest coffee machine. As he finally found one, he spotted Komura and Aiko also having a coffee and talking. Both of them looked incredibly exhausted. Aiko was still crying, the tears just wouldn't stop flowing, while Komura tried to calm her down. Suna realized only now that even Komura was injured, and he began to wonder what had actually happened. The information Osamu and he had received from the hospital was that Atsumu had been shot twice. They didn't think too much of it at first, after all they were worried about how Atsumu was doing, but the longer Suna thought about it, the stranger it all seemed to him. Suna got a coffee for himself and Osamu and then walked over to Komura and Aiko. They greeted each other with faint, tired smiles. May I? Of course. Suna sat down across from the two. Sorry for Osamu's behavior. He didn't mean it that way. Komura smiled weakly and Aiko shook her head. He was right about most of what he said. If only I had never hired Atsumu, then he would have been missing 3 very important people. Suna interrupted Aiko and gave her a small but warm smile. Since Atsumu met you, he has really begun to flourish. He finally did something that he enjoyed from the bottom of his heart, and I know he really cared a lot about you guys. More tears streamed down Aiko's face. She was trembling all over, incredibly worried about Atsumu. Komura put his arm around her shoulder and pulled her a little closer, half hugging. Don't blame yourselves. Whatever has happened, happened. All we can do now is wait for Atsumu to get over the surgery and then get back to nagging all of us. Aiko let a giggle escape her lips under her sobs, and Komura also smiled slightly. He'll be fine, after all, this is Atsumu we're talking about. Suna managed to lift Aiko's and Komura's moods a bit. Aiko looked at Suna with her red puffed eyes. I owe you an explanation as to how this happened in the first place. Suna frowned and tilted his head, then Aiko told him everything that had happened and what Atsumu had been working for her. Aiko didn't cover up anything, she told the whole story. The illegal business, the dangerous missions, the story about Saki. Everything. Suna's eyes widened, he was speechless and couldn't believe the situations Atsumu had willingly put himself into. In fact, everything made sense now. The countless times Atsumu had been injured, the avoidance of talking about work, the shooting. And this Saki? He's dead. Suna swallowed and looked at the two with wide eyes. He was totally tense, never in his life would he have expected such a story. He wasn't even sure if he should fear them. So Suna, if anyone is to blame for all this, it is me. Only thanks to Atsumu, Mori and Kyo I can now live a somewhat normal life again. Only thanks to them I can stop all the crooked business, I finally have the chance to trade with jewels legally and I don't have to fear for my life anymore. Aiko began sobbing again. I got my freedom at the cost of Atsumu's life. Suna grabbed Aiko's hand. Her gaze snapping to him, she froze. You all speak as if Atsumu is going to die. Don't you have any faith in him? Both Komura and Aiko's eyes widened as Suna spoke. As far as I could tell, Atsumu has put all his trust in you. Be patient and do the same. Atsumu will not die. Aiko pressed her lips together and squeezed Suna's hand. Komura nodded, his eyes having caught a few tears by now as well. Thank you, Suna. Suna shook his head and smiled weakly, for him this was only natural. He looked around briefly, then frowned. By the way, where is Sakusa? He needed some fresh air. I think he's blaming himself the most right now. Suna nodded in understanding. He stood up and reached for the coffees he got for himself and Osamu. Maybe it's better if he and Osamu avoid each other for now. Komura and Aiko nodded. Will you let us know if there are any news about Atsumu? Suna smiled weakly. Of course. The two nodded their thanks as Suna turned and walked back to Osamu. The coffee was almost cold by now. Suna hadn't even realized how long he had actually been talking to Aiko and Komura. As Suna reached Osamu, the twin had already fallen asleep. Suna smiled weakly and studied the gray-haired man. He didn't want to wake Osamu up since he was really exhausted. Suna decided to sit down next to him and pull Osamu to him so he could rest his head on Suna's shoulder and have a slightly better sleeping position. He had put the two coffees aside and now laid his head on Osamu's to doze a bit as well. 2 hours later, the two woke up again, totally sleepy and really exhausted. They looked into each other's eyes. Hey. Are you feeling a little better? Osamu shrugged his shoulders. I guess I'm fine. Suna gave him a small smile and ruffled Osamu's hair. He glanced at his phone to check the time. It was now 4:23 a.m. Their gazes snapped up as a tall woman walked towards them. Ah, you must be Atsumu Miya's brother? I'm Dr. Kato, head doctor of the intensive care unit. Osamu looked at the woman dressed in a white coat with confusion and concern. He immediately stood up and Suna did the same, their hands intertwined. Yeah, call me Osamu. Any news? How is Atsumu? Dr. Kato first looked at Suna, a bit confused and worried, then her gaze wandered questioningly to Osamu. Ah, Suna is family. He should hear it too. Dr. Kato nodded. Will you please follow me to my office? Osamu and Suna looked at each other frowning, but then nodded. They followed the head doctor into a small office filled with patient files and paperwork. Osamu closed the door behind him. Please have a seat. Suna sat down at the desk opposite the doctor, while Osamu propped himself up on the back of the chair Suna was sitting in and remained standing. Dr. Kato rummaged through some files until she finally looked at Osamu and spoke. "Your brother did well. He is alive." Osamu sighed in relief, a weight falling from his heart. Suna turned to him and gave him a wide smile. Tears filled the corners of both their eyes. The chief surgeon said it was an extremely complicated operation, but he did it. "Your brother is very weak, he lost a lot of blood and he has a lot of injuries. He was lucky that someone tried to stop the bleeding directly. That was definitely a huge part of saving his life." Suna swallowed. It must have been Sakusa who saved Atsumu from death. "Is he awake? Can I go see him?" "I'll take you to him right away. But there's still a problem." Osamu frowned as he looked at Dr. Kato. The doctor's serious expression made Osamu's eyebrows draw together. He was worried that something worse might have happened to Atsumu. "Your brother lapsed into a coma." Osamu and Suna's eyes widened. Coma. Coma represents a natural survival mode. The body escapes into this unconscious state to avoid great pain or anxiety, to relieve the brain and body, or to give it time to regenerate after severe injuries. After such an operation with these injuries that your brother had, this is not uncommon. Usually a coma lasts a few days, a few weeks at most. That means he will wake up soon? At least that's what we assume. We can't promise anything here, though. Your brother fell into a coma naturally, he has to wake up on his own now. Help him, be there for him, talk to him, give him a reason to come back. Osamu swallowed. What if Atsumu isn't waking up in a few weeks? Dr. Kato sighed. We shouldn't discuss the worst case scenario. I am optimistic that you can bring your brother back. Dr. Kato. What if he won't wake up? Dr. Kato looked into Osamu's serious and fearful eyes for a few seconds. He was incredibly worried about his brother. The longer he remains in a coma, the less likely he'll wake up at all. Osamu's heart stopped for a moment. His face was pale. But Miya-san. Let's not assume the worst. Concentrate on getting your brother back now. Suna squeezed Osamu's hand and looked hopefully into his eyes. Atsumu will wake up soon, Samu. Osamu frowned and nodded. Somehow he didn't have a good feeling about the whole thing at all. Okay, then let's go to his room. Dr. Kato led Osamu and Suna to Atsumu room. Osamu was shaking all over his body. The last time he had seen Atsumu was 2 days ago in his cafe, when they talked about how he was going to propose to Suna, when they talked about how Atsumu was going to be his best man, when they talked about how in love Atsumu was with Sakusa. Osamu entered the room and lifted his gaze. His eyes widened, his whole body trembling even more. Tears welled up in his eyes, his lips quivered. Atsumu. There he was, Atsumu, his whole body covered with wounds that were bandaged. He was being treated with a respirator and appeared so lifeless, it was terrifying. If the machine had not recorded his heartbeat, he might as well have been declared dead. It was creepy the way he was lying in the hospital bed. Wounded, quiet, motionless. Almost dead. Osamu sobbed, rushed to his brother's bedside and collapsed in front of him. He took his hand and looked at Atsumu with tears streaming down his face. Atsumu, what happened to you? Suna frowned and swallowed. He walked slowly towards the twins and placed his hand on Osamu's shoulder while he couldn't take his eyes off Atsumu. He looked terrible. The respirator is only for the first night and day after surgery, afterwards Miya-san should be able to breathe completely on his own again. It is only for safety in case the patient has a dropout while in a coma. The bruises will disappear in a few days, we will treat the deeper wounds daily, everything should actually heal properly at this point. Since the bullets had to be taken out of him, we had to make an incision each time, which unfortunately will leave him with a scar each. Dr. Kato didn't know if Osamu was even listening to her anymore, so she reported all this rather to Suna, who looked at her with a pained expression on his face, but somehow still managed to keep his composure. Suna nodded weakly. "I might leave you alone for now. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions." "Thank you." Suna's voice cracked. He also had to pull himself together. Dr. Kato nodded and left the room, leaving Osamu and Suna alone with Atsumu. For a while no one spoke a word, only the sounds of the machines Atsumu was hooked up to and the recording of his heart rate could be heard. Osamu's gaze was fixed and blank. Seeing his brother like this gave him the rest. Suna frowned, unsure when to tell Osamu about the whole story Aiko had told him. Was now the right time? Or rather the worst? It didn't matter. No matter when Suna would tell him, any time was bad, and the longer he waited to tell him, the worse it would get. Osamu would probably freak out. God knows what he would do to Aiko, Komori, and Sakusa. Suna was literally terrified of Osamu's reaction. Could he calm him down? Suna took a deep breath and grabbed Osamu's hand, causing the gray-haired man to shift his gaze to Suna. Suna winced at the sight, chills going down his spine. "Samu, I was talking to Aiko and Komori earlier about everything that happened with Atsumu." Osamu's eyes widened for a moment, but he remained silent. Suna took another deep breath. "The whole story is pretty fucked up.